President Trump announced that a large armada of United States warships was heading toward Iran. In his words, just in case, we have a lot of very big, very powerful ships sailing to Iran right now. At 5:42 local time, the lights along Iran's coastline flickered faintly in the distance as the enormous outline of the USS Abraham Lincoln carrier strike group moved steadily through one of the most strategically important waterways on the planet. This was no routine passage, and Washington made no attempt to conceal it. The United States had sent Lincoln and 3 guided missile destroyers into the Middle East as tensions with Iran climbed sharply. Officials described the deployment as a measure to promote regional security, though Iran called it destabilizing. Then, as the sun's first pale rays broke across the Persian Gulf, radar operators aboard Lincoln's escort ships noticed dozens of fast, compact contacts forming just beyond the horizon. These were not aircraft. They were not incoming missiles. Instead, they were Iranian naval vessels accelerating from multiple directions toward the American formation. Moments like this, as decades of naval history have demonstrated, are not accidents. They are deliberate actions in a dangerous psychological contest where the distance closing between ships becomes far more threatening than any weapon being fired. Right now, the greatest danger is not firepower. It is how close 2 world powers are willing to let each other get before someone makes the first costly mistake. 3 fast-moving vessels from Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy were no longer staying near coastal waters. Instead, they surged forward, pushing their engines past 25 knots to nearly 30 knots, a speed that immediately distinguished them from normal patrol or observation behavior. The IRGC naval units have repeatedly used high-speed maneuvers in the Gulf to signal political intent rather than conduct standard maritime security operations, especially during periods of heightened friction between the United States and Iran. This time was no exception. Rather than trailing the American formation from a safe distance, the 3 Iranian ships angled directly toward the projected path of the USS Abraham Lincoln carrier strike group. Their course was neither random nor defensive. By cutting across the carrier's expected line of travel, the Iranian vessels placed themselves where every movement by the United States fleet would suddenly carry political weight. As the gap narrowed to under 12 nautical miles, a threshold that maritime analysts often describe as psychologically dangerous for large ships, reaction time began to collapse. At that range, even a small miscalculation can trigger a crisis. This kind of approach reflects what is known as intercept geometry, a calculated positioning that forces the opposing commander to make a visible choice. Shadowing stays parallel. Surveillance stays wide. Intercepts, however, aim straight into the future space a ship intends to occupy. That geometry alone was enough to clarify Iran's intent. At the same time, the geography of the Strait of Hormuz adds another layer of complexity. This narrow maritime choke point is one of the world's most strategic passageways, with roughly 1/5 of global petroleum liquids consumption transiting through its waters on any given day. The very fact that shipments of oil and gas depend on safe passage here means that any disruption, tension, or confrontation has consequences far beyond these waters. What mattered most was what Iran did not do. There were no warning shots, no radio challenges, and no missile systems activated. Instead, the pressure came from speed, angle, and timing. By holding a tight formation and maintaining aggressive momentum, the IRGC Navy signaled that this was not about gathering intelligence. It was about testing how the United States would react when faced with a narrowing corridor and diminishing options. In moments like these, power is measured less by weapons than by restraint. Iran was probing for hesitation, seeking to discover whether the American carrier group would alter course under pressure. The danger was not in firepower, but in the shrinking distance between steel hulls moving fast through one of the world's most unforgiving waterways. The atmosphere aboard the United States formation shifted sharply. What had begun as an unusual radar picture suddenly became impossible to ignore when collision alarms sounded across the escort ships. These alarms are not dramatic effects designed to frighten crews. They are triggered only when onboard systems calculate that vessels are closing at angles and speeds where reaction time is collapsing. Similar alarms have preceded several of the most dangerous encounters between the United States and Iran in the Persian Gulf over the past decade, often occurring when Iranian fast craft deliberately reduce maneuvering space rather than when weapons are involved. Inside the combat information centers, operators watched a tightening pattern emerge on their screens. 3 separate Iranian tracks were no longer moving independently. Instead, they were forming a narrowing triangle aimed at the projected path of the USS Abraham Lincoln. This geometry mattered far more than raw speed. A converging triangle forces a large ship into a visual and political dilemma. Every degree of course change becomes visible, measurable, and open to interpretation by the other side. For a vessel the size of an aircraft carrier, options are limited. Lincoln displaces more than 100,000 tons. While it can sustain high cruising speeds, it cannot turn sharply without planning, nor can it accelerate away from a closing threat in seconds. This is not a sports car avoiding traffic. It is a floating city bound by physics. A sudden maneuver risks not only safety but also signaling weakness. Even minor course changes in contested waters can later be used as political evidence of compliance or retreat. That reality pressed heavily on the bridge crews. The Iranian vessels were small, fast, and positioned precisely where a reaction would be unavoidable. One ship, if placed correctly, can force another to move, not by threatening violence, but by occupying space. Maritime history is filled with such moments where steel hulls, rather than missiles, decided the outcome. This was one of them. The pressure intensified as the closing distance erased the comfort of time. Under 12 nautical miles, decision windows shrink. Below that, hesitation becomes dangerous. Sensors tracked every adjustment in Iranian engine output, every slight change in bearing. Meanwhile, the carrier group held its formation, maintaining a steady transit speed that communicated intent without escalation. The message was quiet but firm. The United States would not rush and it would not flinch. What made the moment especially tense was the absence of noise. No radio challenges broke the silence. No warning shots splashed the water. Instead, both sides relied on posture and placement. This kind of silent standoff is often more destabilizing than open confrontation because it removes negotiation and forces commanders to act based purely on perceived resolve. On the American side, the understanding was clear. This was not a test of speed or firepower. It was a contest of position. Whoever controlled the critical angle would control the outcome. As the Iranian triangle tightened and the alarms continued to pulse, the sense that a decision was approaching became unmistakable. In these moments, seconds matter, angles matter, and restraint becomes a weapon in its own right. This is where naval confrontations are truly decided, not with explosions, but with judgment under pressure. From within the United States formation, one escort broke its perfect symmetry. A guided missile destroyer identified as USS Gravely eased away from its previous position and began a controlled advance toward the narrowing intercept line. This was not a sudden dash. It was a calculated slide, slow enough to appear calm, yet precise enough to reshape the entire geometry of the standoff. United States Navy doctrine in the Persian Gulf often relies on such maneuvers to clarify intent without provoking escalation, especially when facing fast Iranian craft that thrive on forcing quick reactions. In this case, Gravely did exactly that. Rather than chasing the Iranian vessels or turning defensively, it moved directly into the space they were trying to claim. What mattered was not speed, but angle. The destroyer did not cut sharply across the water, nor did it surge forward at full power. Its bow tilted just enough to occupy the projected path of the approaching Iranian ships, quietly placing American steel between the carrier and the pressure point. This type of maneuver is designed to force clarity. When a destroyer claims the decisive angle, the opposing commander must either alter course, escalate openly, or accept the risk of collision. Above the water, the response continued to unfold with equal discipline. As Gravely advanced, the low thrum of rotors cut through the morning air. An MH-60R Seahawk helicopter lifted off and began a wide, deliberate orbit above the intercept zone. Seahawk deployments during close encounters are intended to provide visible awareness rather than intimidation, offering commanders real-time observation without crossing into aggressive signaling. From the Iranian perspective, the message was unmistakable. The Americans were not backing away, and they were not charging forward either. Instead, they were building what naval analysts often describe as a soft wall. It is soft because no weapons fire and no threats are spoken, yet it is a wall because it removes options. The Iranian vessels now faced a narrowing set of choices, each one more revealing than the last. What followed was a moment of suspended tension. The destroyer held its course with machine-like steadiness, maintaining speed and heading with no visible hesitation. The helicopter continued its orbit, its presence impossible to miss against the brightening sky. The carrier strike group behind them remained steady, neither accelerating nor diverting. Together, these movements formed a single coordinated posture. This approach reflects the United States Navy's preference for control over confrontation. By shaping the battle space through position and visibility, American commanders aim to shift psychological pressure back onto the challenger, forcing them to decide whether symbolic defiance is worth real risk. In that moment, the encounter stopped being about how fast the Iranian ships could go. It became about whether they were willing to cross a line that now carried consequences they could not control. The soft wall had done its job. It did not threaten. It did not shout. It simply stood in the way. This is where United States naval power often reveals its most effective edge. Not in dramatic action, but in restraint paired with precision. As the destroyer and helicopter held their positions, the burden of choice shifted decisively. And in the silent space between hulls and wakes, it became clear that the next move would not belong to Washington. The confrontation entered a more delicate phase, one where every movement carried meaning far beyond its physical impact. On the forward deck of the United States destroyer screening the USS Abraham Lincoln, the ship's 5-inch main gun began to rotate. The motion was slow and deliberate, almost casual to an untrained eye, yet unmistakable to anyone familiar with naval encounters. It did not snap into a firing position, nor did it track a specific hull. Instead, it settled at a measured angle toward the direction of the approaching Iranian vessels, signaling a transition from observation to readiness. Similar gun movements have been documented in recent United States Navy encounters in the South China Sea and the Persian Gulf, where the objective was to communicate preparedness without crossing the line into provocation. Almost simultaneously, other systems across the ship adjusted their posture. The close-in weapon system, designed as a last line of defense, shifted into passive tracking mode. Its sensors followed movement silently without emitting the aggressive signals associated with a weapons lock. Radar systems did the same, maintaining wide situational awareness while avoiding any action that could be interpreted as an imminent attack. This restrained posture is a hallmark of United States naval signaling, especially in encounters with Iranian forces where misinterpretation can escalate situations rapidly. Above the water, the MH-60R Seahawk continued its steady orbit. From the outside, the helicopter's flight pattern looked repetitive, even routine. In reality, it was one of the most powerful messages the strike group could send. The Seahawk streamed real-time imagery back to the ships below, capturing every change in Iranian speed, every slight adjustment in formation. Helicopters play a key role in de-escalation by making awareness visible. When an aircraft is overhead, there is no ambiguity about who is watching. What stood out most was what did not happen. There were no radio warnings broadcast over open channels, no threats were issued, and no public statements were made. This silence was intentional. Excessive communication during close encounters can sometimes increase risk by forcing the other side into a public response they feel compelled to defend politically. By staying quiet, the United States Navy allowed Iran space to reconsider without humiliation. The combined effect of these actions created a powerful psychological pressure. The Iranian crews could see the gun's orientation. They could hear the helicopter overhead. They could sense that every movement they made was being tracked and recorded. Yet nothing about the American posture suggested panic or aggression. The carrier group did not accelerate. It did not change course. Instead, it projected a calm confidence that shifted the burden of decision onto the approaching ships. Deterrence at sea rarely depends on dramatic gestures. It depends on clarity. By adjusting weapons without firing, by tracking without locking, and by watching without shouting, the United States communicated a simple message that required no translation. It was aware, it was ready, and it was in control. This moment marked the peak of the psychological standoff. The danger was no longer theoretical, but neither was it uncontrollable. In the quiet hum of engines and rotors, the encounter balanced on a narrow edge defined not by missiles or explosions, but by restraint under pressure. By 6:01 local time, the distance between the opposing formations collapsed to just 4 nautical miles, a range many sailors quietly describe as the maritime gray zone. At this point, there is no buffer left, no comfortable margin for error. Large warships can still maneuver, but every adjustment becomes visible, deliberate, and politically loaded. 4 nautical miles is where most modern naval incidents shift from signaling to genuine risk because reaction time drops to seconds rather than minutes. Despite the tightening space, the Iranian vessels did not slow. Their engines continued to push hard, holding aggressive speed as white wakes carved sharp lines across the water. Even more striking was the silence. No response came over open radio channels, no clarification, no warning, no attempt to frame the encounter verbally. Iranian naval units often avoid radio exchanges in close encounters, relying instead on movement to apply pressure while minimizing direct verbal escalation. From the American side, the response was equally quiet, but far more rigid. The USS Abraham Lincoln carrier strike group did not turn. It did not slow. It did not accelerate. The carrier held its steady transit speed, and the escorting ships maintained their positions with almost mechanical discipline. This was not hesitation. It was intent. Maintaining course under pressure is often the clearest way a navy asserts that international waters remain exactly that. The silence stretched. Seconds passed, then long half-minutes that felt far heavier than any exchange of words. Engines hummed beneath steel decks. Sensors tracked heat signatures, bearings, and wake patterns in real time. Every sailor on watch understood the stakes. At 4 nautical miles, a sudden turn or speed change by either side could force an irreversible chain of reactions. These moments are psychological cliffs where neither side wants to be the first to move, yet both know that inaction cannot last forever. The Iranian ships continued forward, still fast, still silent. Their formation remained tight, their bows cutting directly into the projected space ahead of the American group. For observers, this was the most dangerous moment of the entire encounter. The absence of communication removed any safety net. There were no verbal off-ramps left, only physical choices. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the balance shifted. Sensors aboard the United States escorts registered a change that mattered more than any signal flare or radio call. One Iranian vessel eased off its throttle. Its speed dipped slightly, falling below the aggressive pace it had maintained since the approach began. Within moments, the other ships mirrored the adjustment. Speed reduction is often the first true indicator of de-escalation at sea. The wakes behind the Iranian hulls softened. The sharp, forceful lines began to blur. Their geometry loosened just enough to signal hesitation without announcing retreat. The American formation did nothing in response. No acknowledgement, no change in posture. The carrier continued forward, steady and unmoved, as if the tension had never existed. In that quiet adjustment, the outcome became clear. No shots were fired, no threats were spoken. Yet one side had altered its behavior and the other had not. In close encounters, the first visible concession defines the result more clearly than any formal statement. At 4 nautical miles, Iran blinked. This was the climax of the standoff. Not because something exploded, but because something did not. Restraint held, control prevailed, and the moment passed, leaving behind a lesson that echoes across every contested sea lane. Power is not always proven by action. Sometimes it is proven by who holds the line longest. As the tension finally broke, the change was subtle but unmistakable. The Iranian formation began to loosen, its ships sliding away from the intercept line they had held so aggressively just minutes before. There was no dramatic turn and no public announcement, only a quiet shift in angle that spoke louder than words. In contrast, the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group did not react at all. It kept its speed, held its course, and continued through the Strait of Hormuz as if the encounter had been nothing more than background noise. When pressure fails, withdrawal often comes quietly without acknowledgement. No missiles were armed, no shots were fired, and no alarms echoed beyond the ships involved. Yet the outcome was clear. One side altered its behavior and the other did not. In naval confrontations, that difference matters more than any statement released later on land. Control of the sea is not about who moves fastest or shouts the loudest, but about who controls space and time when it matters most. This moment carried a simple message. On the open ocean, the side that holds position controls the outcome. When the United States does not need to fire, it means the decision has already been made. The confrontation ended not with force, but with restraint, backed by confidence.